Blacks and white architects who are the best in architecture. This is ROK Transmission. Rock over time. Kindly subscribe for more vital videos. Blacks and white architects who are the best in architecture. After years of debate without resolution, make your opinion count by commenting blacks if you think blacks architects are the best in architecture, or whites if you believe white architects are the best in architecture. Before voting, watch this informative video to help you decide. Stay tuned. Explore the architectural masterpieces of Louis Sullivan, a renowned white architect, and David Ajayi, a celebrated Black architect.
We're at the intersection of Bleecker and Crosby in Manhattan, looking at one of Louis Sullivan's early skyscrapers, the Bayard Building, sometimes known as the Bayard Condit Building. It's a little surprising to think about a 12-story building as a skyscraper, but at the end of the 19th century, it was.
A 12-story building might be small today, but in the 1890s, the issue of how to decorate the facade of a building of this size was a great challenge.
So before the passenger elevator, buildings were limited to about 6 stories.
As high as you could walk comfortably.
But there was an imperative to begin to build higher as real estate prices began to increase, especially in places like Lower Manhattan. And it's no surprise that early tall buildings tend to be commercial structures.
In fact, I think the definition of a skyscraper for most of its first century is that of a commercial building, typically offices, but also light industry.
When we think about the early history of the skyscraper, there's an interesting competition between New York and Chicago. And it's important that Louis Sullivan, the architect responsible for this building, was from Chicago.
Historians who were based in Chicago thought it was born there, but in recent years, people have begun to position New York as the place that the skyscraper was born.
And this is his first independent building and his only building in New York City.
This is the first building that he designed after parting with Dankmar Adler.
And it's usually considered part of a group of 3 buildings, the other 2 being the Guarantee Building in Buffalo and the Wainwright in St. Louis.
They are textbook illustrations of his design of what a skyscraper should be, and the much quoted phrase is that a skyscraper should be a proud and soaring thing.
So the idea is that a skyscraper is not something that grows out of economic necessity, but it is something that can be designed thoughtfully. And Sullivan is probably the great exponent of thinking through the possibilities of the early skyscraper.
And he's particularly interested in visual coherence, that you shouldn't just add floors, and that the top and the bottom and the middle should all fuse together into one beautiful facade.
Look at this building. It's gorgeous. This facade is terracotta.
Terracotta, baked clay.
And so what Sullivan did is he had molds carved and then poured liquid terracotta into them. Although it looks hand carved, it is actually mass produced.
It's an incredibly durable material.
Often when we think about terracotta, we think of a glazed surface. We think of something that might be brightly colored.
Or we might think of reddish brown clay.
But here, this building is a kind of ivory color. It's creamy white.
But the key issue about the ornament on this building is it is not derived from the past. It is not ornament that is classical or medieval. It's Louis Sullivan's ornament.
We often think about ornament and modernism as oppositional. And in fact, so much of the ethos of early 20th century modernism was to strip away the non-essential. But here we see a kind of indulging in what is possible with ornament. But for all of the beauty of the decorative surfaces,
in so many different places,
we see it in these wonderful bulbous capitals.
The panels just above those capitals and the reliefs around the windows and the double-wide spandrel panels below the windows. It keeps changing as you move up the facade.
Until you get to the cornice, where you see this explosion of the decorative and these monumental angelic figures with wings outstretched that seem almost to be supporting the cornice itself, almost like ancient Greek caryatids.
It is a motif that I don't believe appears on any other work by Sullivan.
They're so elegant.
But some people feel that they're inappropriate to the building.
And that's because they are the only figurative forms.
Absolutely. He moved away from figurative forms as a form of decoration, and here they are. And because of that, some people have suggested that it was the client who insisted that they be the grand termination of the facade. We'll never really know.
There is this way that Sullivan is bringing our eye slowly but forcefully upward, emphasizing the vertical with those delicate colonnettes and then the wider piers between the window bays. All of it is emphasizing the horizontal, but there's so much to look at as we move upward that my eye is slowed as I enjoy what's being offered.
Your eye is meant to rise, and these vertical piers that alternate with the colonnettes only have one destination, and that is those angelic figures at the top, or the cornice that stops your eye so that you are forced to look down and examine the incredible concentration of ornament that surrounds the angelic figures.
So unlike earlier skyscrapers that were in some ways trying to hide their height, this is a building that seems to be comfortable with its height, that seems to be celebrating its height. But all of the decoration that we've been talking about is to please the eye. None of it is structural. None of it is doing any of the work of holding up the building.
It's a curtain wall. The steel frame is inside, it's not meant to be seen, and the curtain wall is simply to give us pleasure.
Now, the curtain wall was a relatively recent invention, and this called for a steel or iron frame upon which the building would be set.
Traditionally, a structure was held up by its walls. In a curtain wall building, a structure is held up by its metal frame that is not visible from the street.
But we can see where that frame is if we peer into the lower story of the building and we look at some of the large columns within.
That's right. It's like a parade of columns marching deep into the building.
And we can imagine within those columns steel that rise up the full height of the building.
And those girders are echoed on the facade by the thick piers that mark the 5 bays.
Sullivan would have an enormous impact on early 20th century modern architecture, especially on the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, for example.
It's interesting how, despite all of the ornament, there's a certain simplicity and clarity to the facade. Many people consider Louis Sullivan to be the father of the skyscraper. The techniques that are critical to its development were developed by others, but he gave it great thought, and he was one of the few architects during this period to write about how he felt it should go forward.
Explore the architectural masterpieces of David Ajayi, a celebrated Black architect.
I was inspired to do architecture because of this potential that I discovered as a young man, that architecture had the power to frame the social context and to edify and empower communities in profound ways. And in realizing that and in studying architecture, I realized that I wanted to practice as much as possible in the public realm and to be in the most democratic arena to inspire and influence the greatest amount of people. For me, architecture is one of those beautiful art forms that continually has to be remade, continually has to be refined for every generation. It's not as though we just make one architecture and then that's it. It has to be recalibrated. And so this really is at the heart of why we work. And the idea of sort of really making sure that we are bringing as much knowledge into the experience of architecture is central to how me and myself and my studio work. We use, the knowledge that we know from working in the US, the knowledge that we know and use from working in Europe to try and create a diversity in our knowledge base that really gives the most exceptional, we believe, product to our clients and to our communities. A lot of the initial work and still at the base of the foundation of the practice is to make visible those forces, communities, institutions that are invisible in our world. And it's not the formal structures, but it's the idea of understanding that as citizens in any community, you sort of enter a contract to be good to each other, to be supportive of each other. And that means that there is your private role in your house, which is your private realm, but there is your public role. And that's your the things you do, you vote, you act on things to kind of create edification opportunities for yourself and for the generations that are to come after you. So we are sort of custodians, not just of the world that we live in, the way we want to see it for ourselves, but also custodians of making a future for generations who haven't even been born yet. I always say in my studio, yes, I'm an employee, but you're sort of entering a sort of vocation. You're kind of entering a group of people who are passionate about ideas in the world, about our public life, and want a certain equality that actually brings benefit to everyone, and passionately believe that in that equality, we actually make a much, much better world than we can if we don't do that. And it's not a statement, it's a belief. So this way of working and trying to kind of navigate how to create spaces that are democratic across all members of society, all genders, disenfranchised as well as those that are very fortunate, is really a critical thing that we're always shifting. And what's really amazing is that in the history of architecture, this idea of democratizing shifts and changes. In the 18th century, it was about making palaces for everyone. It was about introducing Greek temples as symbols of knowledge. That was the 18th century because we were moving from a kind of medieval period, a renaissance that happened in Europe, and a certain sense that that was an enlightenment that needed to happen around the world, to kind of quote history. But those symbols are very important historical models, but mean different things now. They start to kind of form different messages. So we need, as architects, just as we transformed the world in the 1800s, in the 1900s, in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century, here we go again. So I have to say that Winter Park is really punching so high up, because really what is happening with the project that I think is so powerful is that another prototype, another version of what the library has evolved already in the last 20 years is being tested right in Winter Park. And what I mean by that is that the library as a campus of knowledge. So we're moving from the object building, or the kind of what I call the kind of infrastructure of knowledge, to the space of knowledge. And that is really what we're trying to prototype in Winter Park because of the opportunity of the scenario. We're making a space where knowledge and community facilities are being brought together in a cluster to make a sort of little village, a hamlet of knowledge. This is so unique. I don't know anywhere short of a library on sort of a campus on a university where that kind of clustering of knowledge in the public realm has happened. And that's why I'm so excited about what's happening in Winter Park. It's been a wonderful challenge, but also a big learning curve for us too, to learn how to make buildings in a tropical environment. In terms of the structure, being able to deal with hurricane proofing, etc., dealing with things very simple like just termite proofing and worrying about the ground condition.
It's the alligators, it's swamp, and then the sun is much, much stronger. So shade is coveted everywhere. Trees and landscape are coveted. What I wanted to also do was to make within the form, to use investigations that I'd already been testing, but to exaggerate them even more, to see if one could make not a form with subforms, as in a building with a canopy structure that interconnects, which is the natural thing that happens. It's blocks with eaves or freestanding canopies, but somehow if we could make the forms actually become both canopy and building form as one sort of idea. So in a way, the buildings are like buildings within buildings. The outer shell splay out very dramatically and almost touch and almost create a kind of, when you're in the spaces in between that, a sort of sense of an interior, because you look up and you have these slices of sky, but you're very much in shade. Something that I do in my work, this idea of understanding the kind of airflow and the way in which we can climatically reduce the temperature. And those spaces are going to be 5 or 6 degrees cooler than the outside area, so they're dramatic in terms of outside temperature, in terms of the body's sort of relationship to sweat and things like that. So they become, as it were, the joining spaces in this project, the atrium for the program. So really, the investigation really is to see if we can use the buildings to create this third space, which is the joining between all three of them to create a public, sort of shaded, cool space that becomes an inside-outside space. And that's something I'm very fascinated by. So this is doing it with proximity and geometry and form.
It's sort of interesting. I became very fascinated by this idea of vaulting spaces as a way to differentiate it from sort of flat commercial spaces, which are very functional and very much about, utility and just kind of doing the best efficient things, which you see typically in office buildings. We wanted these buildings to have a certain kind of distinction in their profile that would really signify to anybody entering that this was a special room for the community. And so this idea of creating a series of rooms, what I'm calling public rooms, that really will make people feel that they are in something that's for them, something that will actually shift the way in which people see the spaces and use the spaces in a very dramatic way. I think that if you talk to people now, when you talk about a vaulted space or an art space, they think of ruins only. Maybe it's a trip to Italy or somewhere like that, or an old cathedral or something like that. And we wanted to bring back that incredible sort of audacity of those buildings and their beautiful sections to create these beautiful shapes into something as everyday as we believe a library should be. It should be as everyday as just going down to use the park. It should be that infrastructure that really supports the way in which you grow in your community, or you mature in your community, or you contribute to your community. And it becomes an infrastructure that really is there to help that public life. You know, MLK, Martin Luther King really, was very much about the empowerment of communities through knowledge, through the sort of emancipation of your condition, through the access to knowledge as a way to kind of empower yourself. So in a way, we're sort of building a monument to his ideals of being able to democratically give all citizen access, very good community support, great spaces to listen, to discuss, to debate. So I've been working with libraries for 20 years now. The internet has been a huge impact on the way in which we do see libraries. Libraries post-war were about getting the Encyclopedia Britannica and as many books as you could into every community to empower and edify. And academic libraries, which are universities, etc., are all about having the back catalogs. But a community library is very different. It's about having the essential things that support those communities in the right concentrations. But it's also about offering all the opportunities that the sort of ritual of going to a library has now afforded communities. It's where you do lifelong learning. It's where you have flexible spaces for teaching programs, and also just spaces that are differentiated to just being hushed at a desk, with shelves all around you, that traditional image of a library. You want kids to be able to sit on the floor, sit on steps, be outside on the Wi-Fi, working and thinking about ideas. That's how we are now working in our world. So we want the library to reflect that, especially within architecture that's for communities, for the public. I think that it's important to have architecture and all that sort of professionalism, but the humility to be able to make something that comes from the place. I think it's very important that architects have humility when dealing with public projects, to be able to listen to the discourse, to be able to listen to different views. And it's hard. I'm not saying it's easy. It's very tough. And sometimes it sort of implodes, and it kind of reforms again. And we're able to then find consensus and to find where we agree and how we can grow things. These are very important things at the formal edge as well as the community edge. And for me, there's engagement with things that emanate from a place is very, very foundational to the way I make all my work. It's not just even community or public work. It's really for me that there's a kind of humility that has to be had in the honor of being given a public commission, which will help define a community and define the communities that to come. But as I said right at the beginning of my talk, it is something completely unique. This has not happened anywhere. It hasn't happened on any library projects that I've done, that there is an investment in a public infrastructure as a campus of knowledge, a space of knowledge beyond a single object building. This is a clustering of a place to be edified in a beautiful bucolic park, which is about edification and sustenance. So they're both resuscitative. One is mental resuscitation, the other one's a physical resuscitation, and they work as a kind of dialectic, a double that really replenish the public life of the citizen. The library is no longer just a space for books. It is a place of the community. That is what the library has transformed into. We're making a campus. We're making a village of knowledge, and it's in this beautiful space, and it's powerful.
Make your opinion count by commenting blacks. If you think blacks architects are the best in architecture, or whites, if you believe white architects are the best in architecture. Kindly subscribe to this channel for more insightful information. Thank you. May you be blessed. Goodbye.